30 minutes of power.
Welcome to 30 Minutes of Power, a podcast dedicated to educate, encourage, and inspire godly people to use their power to empower others. Join your hosts, Jory O'Neill and Nicole Salter, as they share powerful insights on how you can use your God-given talents and gifts to make a positive impact in the world.
All right, welcome everybody to 30 Minutes of Power, TOP, your one-stop shop for all things encouraging, motivating, and inspiring. This podcast is dedicated to folks, godly individuals who use their power to empower others. And I'm super encouraged, honored, and excited to have with me Senior, Pastor Edward L. Palmer.
Nice to be with you.
Man, it's been a minute trying to get you on here, cuz. It's been a minute. And I say cuz because we are family. I don't know if y'all see the delicious resemblance, all the high cheekbones going on. Fantastic teeth. I got some work on mine. His is natural. I love it. And so we are here today talking about youth empowerment. We are still on our series, Mocked versus Marked. And I couldn't think of a better individual to round out our series, talking about ending the school to prison pipeline. And so as we jump right into this, I don't want to waste any time. If you have any questions, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put them in the chat. And at the end, we're going to have a little Q&A with Cuz. But to start things off, I want to ask, Cuz, could you share a little bit about, I guess, your personal journey and I guess what led you to become an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, the juvenile justice system?
Yeah, so of course I'm a pastor full time. So 27 years ago, I moved from the Chicagoland area to Kentucky and immediately got involved with youth programming. And the more I dove into systems that came in contact with our youth, the more I began to see across systems significant disproportionality and disparities in outcomes for Black and brown youth. That became a passion to address the issue of racial and ethnic disparity, which over the last 2.5 decades kind of got me involved with Georgetown University to do a fellowship on racial and ethnic disparity, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice out of Washington, D.C. I actually spent some time as their vice chair and chair. And I've done significant, diversity consulting around the country, but specifically here in Kentucky with the Kentucky Court of Justice on addressing racial inequities within our juvenile justice system here in Kentucky.
Hey, wow, that's a mouthful. It's a lot of experiences that you had. So I think my question dives more so in were there any personal experiences? So I can share for me on my end, my desire, my drive to become an educator and to really push the idea of education is coming from the family that we both come from, seeing that education opened doors, that unfortunately growing up, I assumed were closed just because I looked how I looked, but learning that education and the very thing, which is affirmative action, actually allowed individuals like myself and many others to be able to be accepted into prestigious universities and such and so forth. And so I guess my question is more so, is there like a personal drive that you specifically have that pushes you forward to do this work? You said, how long have you done this work again?
For about 2.5 decades. So my personal drive comes every time I look in the mirror and see this Black skin on my body. That's where it started. It started with seeing inequities across systems. It didn't matter whether they were juvenile or youth serving systems, or whether they were things like housing and banking and inequities in health, inequities in retail theft. You just name it. Everywhere I looked, I saw Black people experiencing the worst end of just about every system that I encountered. Fast forward now, I have little African American grandkids, right? So I have a 21-year-old, soon to be 20-year-old twins, 15-year-old, 14-year-old, and a 6-year-old, right? And so I know that my grandchildren are more likely going to at some point in their childhood or their adolescent years misstep. My passion is to make sure that when they misstep, the systems that they come in contact with don't mishandle them, right? I want my kids to get the same opportunities and the same do-overs as kids who are not black and brown, and who are not coming from a low socioeconomic status. So I work hard because of the black skin I carry on my body, but also because I'm raising black and brown grandchildren. I have raised two African American children, and so that's what drives me.
I love that. And so you mentioned a little bit about being a consultant for some of the diversion programs. And I know from reading your bio on your website, The Messenger, that you consulted also for the very state in which you live in the Kentucky diversion program. So can you talk about a couple of those initiatives that were started there to help in the school to prison pipeline that is so prevalent and has been, honestly, for the last 3 decades, especially since certain administration had put into play, the 3-strike rule and things of that nature, and doubling down on minor drug infractions, which impacted more Black and browns than it did anything else. What initiatives have begun to end that school to prison pipeline, specifically for Kentucky, that you've seen?
Well, I think one of the things we experienced in 2014, we had juvenile justice reform. A good friend of mine, a guy by the name is Senator Whitney Westerfield, was the author of a piece of legislation that basically reformed the juvenile code here in Kentucky. What that did was gave more opportunities for young people to get front-end diversion opportunities, right? Instead of sending them to court and opening that door or that pathway to deeper involvement in our juvenile justice system, this new legislation gave them more opportunities, more bite at the apple, if you will, to keep them out of the court system and expand opportunities to go to diversion. One of the things that impacted was it impacted what the schools could actually send a kid to court for versus expanding the opportunity for that same kid to go to a diversion program and have opportunities over and over again until we hopefully can get to success, to get that kid to a good place and a good space in lieu of sending that kid to court and possibly ending up in a juvenile detention center or some form of state commitment.
Okay, so what are the, I guess, the challenges that might exist in creating programs that prevent the large number of Black and brown children? I looked at some of the numbers for Kentucky, but being currently a New York resident, right, we're both originally from Chicago,
Right.
the number of Black and brown children who are repeat offenders, right? And so the rate of recidivism that exists here, because of a lack of programs, right, that cut off their even introduction to juvenile justice, right? So we have a justice system, but the goal is for young people not to necessarily interface with them at a young age, because the rate of it occurring again becomes higher the earlier on that they encounter them. So what are some difficulties or some challenges, I guess, that you've seen in implementing some of these programs?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is always having to fight back on the political rhetoric that is to the advantage of some, to be tough on crime, to create zero tolerance policies, to overreact to a bad incident that may have happened somewhere in the state or maybe a neighboring state. Every time we have a school shooting or some kind of significant event in schools, we have this rush of every kid that's fighting, every kid that's threatening another student could be the next school shooter. And so we're constantly having to deal with, this idea that because kids are doing normal adolescent misbehaving, that somehow or another this is going to lead to some really bad outcome. So that's one of the things, is constantly having to push back on some of the political rhetoric that around being tough on crime. One of the challenges that we face is sometimes getting kids who are involved in multiple systems and trying to help them on multiple fronts. So we have a lot of kids who get involved in our child welfare system, and subsequent to their involvement in the child welfare system, they're now involved in the juvenile justice system, and the service array for those different systems in many cases doesn't look the same. And then if you add a mental health challenge on top of that, now we've got 3 levels of involvement that needs to occur to kind of help get this kid to the best possible place. So the challenges that we've faced over the years have just been, again, trying to hold on to the advances that we have made in getting kids into diversion. And when we get them into diversion, the numbers are phenomenal. 90%, more than 90% of our kids, I think the last data I saw said 93% of the kids that get an opportunity to go diversion complete it, right? Successfully complete their diversion, right? And 60% of those kids don't recidivate in a 3-year period. So these are, if you could take 93% and get success with kids, and then 60% of those kids you won't see in the system in the next 3 years, right? Diversion works. It has phenomenal outcomes for kids that get access to diversion, right? But we're having to fight back those who want to push back on giving kids multiple opportunities to grow out of some of these behaviors. All the adolescent brain development science tells us that if we don't overreact, these kids will grow out of some of these behaviors, right? But if we interrupt this normal maturation of the brain, then what happens is they end up lingering in these periods, and oftentimes they get worse as a result of some of the overreaction on the part of the systems.
So I'm kind of glad that you shifted the perspective there. What part do educators play in this? Because again, as an educator, former restorative justice coordinator at my school, the first dean at my current high school, seeing the number of students on our ORS reports, right? The Office of Offenses and Retention, Suspension, things of that nature. It was alarming, right? Going from a classroom teacher to now kind of peeking behind the curtain, seeing
Right.
the number of Black and brown students. And I'm in a business technology, early college, right? So all the students who are college ready and great region scores and high graduation rates, but it was still a very large number of Black and brown students being suspended versus their counterparts. And it wasn't just white counterparts, it was white and Asian counterparts, like when comparing the numbers. And I'm thinking to myself, like, but they're almost engaged in the same behaviors. So why was one discrepancy more often than the other? And so how can schools and educators, I guess, contribute to breaking this cycle? Any approaches that you found proven effective in educators, right? Classroom teachers.
Right. Well, one of the things I would do is start right there, the data, right? You suggest, based on what you just said, that kids committing similar offenses are having differential processes applied to them, or differential responses applied to them, right? So let's start there. Let's start with, exposing this disparity in treatment, right? 2 kids got into a fight, right? 2 kids were involved in fights. One was Black, one was white, and the results, right? The outcomes for those kids were different. When we see that, right, then let's have a conversation as to why are there being different processes and different responses applied to kids, right? And start to look at our systems, our policies, our practices, and really ask the tough questions of the way we do what we do, and whether or not our behaviors as system folks, right, our responses as system folks are creating the disparate outcomes that we're seeing, right? Because as you said, and we know this here in Kentucky as well, we see kids similarly situated as it relates to offenses end up with different outcomes, right? And so, in my implicit bias training, one of the things we talked about is how we perceive the behavior of Black and brown kids versus white kids committing the same behavior, right? When white kids mouth off to a teacher, it's not seen as threatening as it is when a Black kid, especially a Black boy, mouths off at a teacher, right? She or he is more afraid because of the Black male versus the white male, or even the Black female versus the white female, right? So start with the data, right? And really expose, this differential response that we have to kids who are similarly situated when they come in contact with the disciplinary part of our processes. And yet we see all time and time again, the outcomes, Black kids versus white kids and Asian kids, and even sometimes Latino or Hispanic kids, we see the outcomes different, right? And then start having some tough conversations about what happens with our policies and our practices that create these disparate responses and ultimately these disparate outcomes.
So you mentioned in your diversion program or your diversion training, can you speak more to that? Because I know what you do and how passionate you are about what you just stated.
Mm-hmm.
But I want anyone who's listening to know what resources there are available, even specifically with you,
Mm-hmm.
that would allow institutions as well as organizations to be trained on how not to overreact, on how to identify their implicit bias, right? Not to say, oh, I don't see color. No, you should see color.
Right.
You should definitely, absolutely see color because it exists.
Right.
And not only shall you see it, but it should then serve as an informant into how you move.
Right. Yeah.
So can you share a little bit about the training that you do and some
Well,
of the
there are many different trainings I get an opportunity to do. I do a phenomenal implicit bias training. Johns Hopkins University has spent time researching my implicit bias training, wrote academic articles on the effectiveness of my implicit bias training. I do avoiding cultural and racial collisions training. I do anti-racism training. I do diversity, equity, inclusion training. But what I really love to do is work with system stakeholders to really look into the data and begin to deal with system mapping, contact points, decision points, and talk about those particular contact points and decision points through a racial lens, right? Let's look at these things and disaggregate this data specifically around race, ethnicity, gender, and we can continue to pull back layers and layers of ways of looking at this data. But one of the things I love to do with systems is let the data kind of drive and direct the process, right? After we get data, and the data tells us what we don't know. Oftentimes, the data tells us what we suspected, but now the data kind of clearly paints a picture as to who's experienced the best, right? Always start with systems. What is the best outcome for all of your students? And then when you say, well, is that they all complete their high school education and they complete their high school education, career and or college ready, right? That's the best outcome. Okay, let's see who's experiencing your best outcome, right? And when we start to see that white kids are most likely to experience the best outcome and Black and brown kids are less likely to experience the outcome, then let's start talking about what policies, what practices are impacting these outcomes, right? Let's not blame them. Let's not say it's because they don't have fathers in the home. These are things kids can't change, right? Let's not talk about growing up in poverty, right? Let's not talk about mom who's never there because she's working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads and food in their stomach. Let's talk about how your system is doing equity work to make sure these kids have access and opportunity to experience the same thing that these other kids are experiencing without as much effort, right? And so I love to get into systems and actually peel back their processes, look at policies, see what policies and practices are actually driving or influencing the disproportionate representation, the disparate outcomes. And then let's start talking about how do we begin to change those policies, rewrite those policies, institutionalize a new way of doing things, right? There's a big difference, and I hear this all the time. We treat all kids the same, but that doesn't work, right? Equity work is what we have to do. There's a big difference between equity and equality, right? Equality says, let's just treat everybody the same, but everybody's not the same. Equity says, let's treat everybody based on their unique positioning. Let's treat everybody based on their unique needs, right? And when we look at certain communities, they're not as resourced as other communities, right? And so you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with certain behaviors and certain things that occur in school, right? And so how do we begin to do equity work and make sure the kids who are disadvantaged are brought to a higher level based on equity initiatives that give them an opportunity to be as successful as the kids who are well-resourced, kids who have access to after-school tutoring and programs, kids who have access to healthcare, kids who have stable homes, right? How do we give kids who need an opportunity in school that they may not have access to within their communities, right? And we can't keep blaming their communities and their familial structures for what the school is reluctant to do in the form of equity work, right? We got to teach every kid. One of the superintendents I get to work with says, know every kid by name and need. We've got to begin to know our kids and what they need and do effective equity work.
I'm writing notes.
All right.
Nicole, you want to jump
ask
into the
a
next question? Yeah.
I actually want to, I don't know about the next question, but I do have a question. You mentioned that we're not going to focus on home status, right? And I do feel like that it is important to not solely focus on home status, but what happens to the children and the students that don't even listen to their parents? Like, how do you, or what do you, what kind of programs do you have to even begin to try and form a relationship with them? Because already from them even coming into schools or coming into the different programs, they already have this guard up, right? And this
Right.
guard looks like a mean football player that just wants to tackle you all the time. So how do you even begin to create a program where they will feel safe enough to let that guard down and actually talk to you so that you can make their lives better? They can accept what you're saying instead of it just going in one ear and coming out of the other.
Right. And that's the difficult piece right there, right? The difficult piece is how do I make a unique connection with every kid, right? We want to bark out orders and we want all the kids to respond identically, right? We don't know what that kid's got going on at home, right? We know that there's something going on at home, right? And oftentimes I hear system folks talk about these families, right? But until you walk a mile in their shoes, right? You need to back up and figure out how you can make a connection with this kid, right? So that you can help this kid. And maybe the kid doesn't have the things he or she needs in the confines of their home, right? And so maybe there's another caring adult. Maybe there's another significant adult that can connect with that kid and begin to make up for some of those deficits in the home or in the community, right? So we can't really blame them for things in their lives that they can't change. We call that indirect effects, right? Those are things that a kid can't change. They can't change being poor. They can't change not having a father in the home or mom passed away and they're being raised by a grandparent. These are things they can't change, right? And these are things that, traumatically speaking, they may, be suffering some kind of emotional trauma as a result of some of the things that are going on in community and in home. So connection, to me, is the key to each individual kid, right? And some are going to be easier, but some are going to be significantly difficult, right? And so, but we can't blame the kid, right? So I always tell system folks, right? You have the kid, whether it be from 8 to 3, 8 to 4, 9 to 4, whatever it is, you have the kid. And so how do we connect with that kid in a way to to try to give that kid the opportunity and access to have the best possible outcomes, right? And so it is difficult. I'm not saying that this is easy, but one of the things we have to change is our paradigm in thinking that same treatment is going, one size is going to fit all. It's not, right? Each kid has unique challenges. Each kid comes to school with a unique pathway as to how they got there, different things they're struggling with, and you never know what that kid is going to walk through that door with. And a lot of times, what comes off as anger is really hurt, right? These kids are hurting, and they don't know how to deal with that, right? And
Right.
so they come off as angry, they come off as indifferent, and sometimes as adults, we respond to that, and then we have negative reactions that, of course, the kid is waiting for that, expecting that, right? And so one of the things we have found, we have a diversion program at our church, and we get those kids. And one of the things I've said to our coordinators over and over again, we know that they have issues when they come to us, right? We need to get beyond all of our issues and try to find a connection with each and every kid. And we've yet to fail to find a connection with each and every kid that comes through our doors, right? But it's
That's
hard
great.
work. It's hard work. Yeah.
I'm sure it is hard work. Do you have a program? I'm sorry if I'm going off the questions. I just have one more, I promise. Do you have a program where you help to include parents in what your goals and your visions are for
Yes.
your students?
Yes. Our diversion programs include our parents in some of their community service projects. It includes our parents in coming to their diversion programs and eating meals with them and sitting down and having conversations with them about issues related to the offenses that they may have been charged with, their school interactions, and even sometimes their interactions within the home. And so our parents are very much involved in the programming of our diversion program. So oftentimes they have an opportunity to interact with their kids in the process of talking about the challenges that they face. Yep.
That's great. I'm sorry. That led me to one more question.
You're fine.
I apologize.
I feel like this was like what is this, a divine intervention? This is what I feel like. It's great. It's great.
Do you get any pushback from parents? Because I've seen in my community where some parents, as soon as you say their child did something wrong, they're like, no, my child can never do that. Me, I'm the total opposite. I will blame you for doing something until I process it and say, no, my child is not, that's not their personality. That's not, but I'll blame my child first and I'll let them know this is not right. And then I'll be like, wait, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have screamed at you.
Yeah.
I don't think that you would do something like this. Please explain the story to me. Do you get pushbacks when you try to explain to parents what they might need to change in their home or what they might need to improve on as far as like making relationships closer with their children?
No, no, because one of the things we don't do is we don't really deal with blaming parents or making
Okay.
them feel as if there's something wrong in their home. What we deal with is trying to build assets, right? We're trying to build and strengthen their relationships, and so we're not coming from this perspective that this is missing, therefore, right? We're coming from them with this idea of let's interact more, let's have more interaction with your kid. Let's participate in this process together. So we're really trying to be proactive in getting our parents to share, to be involved. And so because we don't come at them with this whole idea that somehow or another there's something broke in your home, right? We come at the idea with why don't we try these things, right? Some of these positive things that they can do with their kids to build resilient and strong relationships, things that they can do their kid to open up that communication a little bit. If they need help dealing with school administrators, right? How can we help you to deal with your child's school administrator or teachers, right? And so we're all about trying to build these positive interactions with families. So we don't really approach it in a way that causes them to be defensive, right?
I love it.
Yeah, we try to approach it as, we're trying to build a better son, a better daughter, right? And here's where we need your help, right? Here's some things you all can try, right? Sometimes it's games they play together. Sometimes the kids will do a project that is a message to the parents, right? And then the parents have an opportunity to respond to that message, right? And so I love it because our kids come in and when they come to us, it's because they've been charged. A formal complaint has been filed, and and they start with writing societal rules, right? And they say things like, "We don't need the popo," snitches get stitches, and all these crazy things that they feel like got them in trouble. And then when we start to talk about the consequences of similar behaviors, right? And all of a sudden, by the time they get 5, 6 weeks in our program, they start changing those rules. Yes, we need the police. And yes, if that happened to my grandmother, I'd want somebody to snitch or tell, right? And so all of a sudden they have this whole process of realizing that society isn't out to get them and that we have rules and we have structures in place, because if we don't, your mom, your grandparent, say for instance, the kid is arrested for shoplifting, right? And he comes from a family who's struggling, right? Well, we tell them the impact of shoplifting on your mother's already stressed budget, right? Your mother has a hard time, paying the bills and things like that. Well, shoplifting drives the costs up, right? And it creates more challenges for your parent, right? And also the kids start to see a bigger picture and change their mindset on even the behaviors that they were previously engaged in. And this is exactly why when they go through an effective diversion program, they're less likely to re-enter the system again, because they have a broader perspective on the impact of some of the mischievous behaviors that they engaged in.
Wow, I love it.
And
I love
so I had the privilege of picking my cousin's brain. Maybe like 3, 4 months ago, I think I had reached out to you and asked you in terms of creating a diversion program. And he shared very much this model, the Shepherd model, of creating a supportive community around the young person, where it bridged school and home and church. And my intention, and so recently I created this thing called the Clear Youth Project, and the premise of that is to catch kids on the front end. So before they even get an official complaint against them, giving them those mindset shifts, introducing them to a supportive community, a wraparound service, well before they even come in contact with the juvenile justice system. And part of me trying to spread that was implementing it with nonprofit organizations, partnering with churches. So what can individuals and communities do, I guess, to contribute to the effort? So you said this diversion program is run from the Sign of the Dove, which is your church where you are the pastor at. But if there are other organizations or other churches out there, what is one of the first steps that they can do to kind of wrap arms around these young people who may have had already some sort of contact with the juvenile justice system?
Yeah, I think being informed about what's happening to our kids. See, we live in communities, and until it happens to my kid, I can walk around with blinders on that is happening to our kids, right? And so I developed a community engagement piece for our former First Lady of the state. And the first part of that piece dealt with community education, right? Bringing the systems into community and really educating the community on what does DCBS or child welfare, what is the impact that they have on kids in your community? What are the resources that they need to keep kids in your community, right? So educating community stakeholders about what's really happening around them, right? Because oftentimes we go to work, we come home, we live in our home, we live with our small group of relatives or friends that we interact with, and we really don't realize the impact of systems until they impact us, right? And so helping community leaders and community advocates fully understand what's happening in their community, their zip code, if you will, their school district, if you will, right? And help them to see the amount of children that come in contact with the system and the lack of opportunity to keep these kids on the right track within their communities. Oftentimes, when our kids come in contact with the system, the solutions are not within our community. The solutions are not within people who look like us, right? And so we end up going to foster homes where people don't understand how to comb our black hair. They don't understand how to take care of our black skin, right? And so the child welfare system needs to help Black communities understand we need foster parents. We need opportunities for kids right here in your own community, right? In the drug treatment world, when kids are having drug substance use disorders, right? Again, the treatment centers are not typically located in our community. The treatment centers are not typically run by people who look like us, who understand us, who speak like us, right? And so oftentimes we're less likely to get in treatment. And if we get in treatment, we're less likely to complete our treatment because we've got to go over there and we've got to deal with them people, right? And so communities need to know what we need to build up in our communities to support our own, right? But we need to understand the magnitude and the scope of the problem that exists within our communities, especially when our children come in contact with these systems. You know, you talk about the prison, the school to prison pipeline. I long time ago got off of that bandwagon because here's what I know: that any system that comes in contact with the Black family has a prison cell at the end of it. Our kids come in contact with the child welfare system, they're most likely to have the worst outcomes. They're most likely to be the ones who exit that system through emancipation, meaning they never got to go back home, they never got to have a family. And the results of that often ends up in this seamless transition into drug use, homelessness, oftentimes death on the street, and oftentimes adult incarceration, right? And so it's any system that comes in contact with us typically leads us to these worse outcomes as adults, right? And so we need to be able to come into communities and educate people about what's happening to their family and their friends, their church members. I'm one of those pastors who got involved long before I had a congregation of the size that I would have families dealing with these issues, right? And so oftentimes you won't know that these issues exist until it hits home, and we need to interrupt that cycle and actually get community leaders together and educate them on what's happening in their systems, right? How many kids are getting caught up in the system for behaviors that kids on the other side of town are not even going to court for, right?
So much good stuff. So local church, you work in local church. You also spoke about your work with John Hopkins and the scholarly medical articles that you helped to contribute to, and your work in DC. When you're speaking to a more personal congregation versus on the floor, right? At maybe DC, the Congress or House meeting, how do you inspire with these very, very differing audiences that you're speaking to? Like, how do you still move them?
Yeah, one of the things I always tell folks as a speaker, a consultant, is I research my audience. Right, it's easy for me when it comes to church people. Right, Isaiah 53 talks about taking care of those who experience injustice, and so those things are easy for me when it comes to church folks. But when I'm talking to judges, I educate myself on what they value. Right, you know, contrary to a lot of belief, there's a lot of good men and women on the bench who want to see the best possible outcomes for all kids, right? And so what is it that they value? What is it that they truly want to see? And then what I do is come with ideas and options and opportunities to actually help judges, help police officers, help educators to achieve those outcomes, right? Just because kids don't have resources doesn't mean we continue to send them deeper into the system, right? Because the truth be told, a kid that comes from a very affluent family, a very well-off community, is likely to come before the judge with lots of resources in place, lots of opportunity for rehabilitation. And so that kid gets to stay in place while they work these programs for this kid and get this kid on track. Kid from another community happens to be Black, happens to come with all of these challenges in life and doesn't have access to the same opportunities, right? And so now the best way to get this kid access is to connect him with services. Well, where are the services? Often they're associated with agencies, right? So now this kid gets a commitment to an agency so he can get access to what this kid is getting through private insurance and through his family's resources, right? Well, judges don't want to send these kids deeper into the system, right? While this kid gets to go home, but oftentimes that's the only option, right? And so how do we go into these disadvantaged communities and provide advantages that allows our kids to come back to us and get services and opportunities right where they live, right? And so now we've got to go back and we've got to build these communities. We got to build capacity in these communities. We got to provide resources to these communities. Listen, Black communities have had women and men and organizations that have been about helping Black people grow, helping Black people get education, helping Black people get jobs, right? And so how do we go in and find these resources, build these resources up, expand the capacity of these resources so that practitioners have opportunities for these kids within their communities with people who look like them, who understand them, and who know how to relate to them, right? And so this is our challenge. This is our challenge. And this is one of the things I love to work with systems about, is not just talking about these communities, but actually talking to these communities. How do we have a conversation with these communities about how to best service their needs? How do we have a conversation with these communities about how to build the capacity so that they can meet the needs of their community members?
So that it made me think of so we had a former guest on here, Aisha Oliver, who is the CEO and founder of Root to Fruit. It's a nonprofit organization that works in the Austin area of Chicago, Illinois. And she has single-handedly, honestly, for the last 19 years, worked with these youths, increasing graduation rates. You talk about school to prison pipeline. These boys don't, and majority of them are men. They've never been exposed to the juvenile justice system because she's wrapped arms around them from the age of 9 years old. And so one of the issues that she had was that there are many programs who on paper say that they do one thing, but when it comes to actual implementation in the community, they're nowhere to be found. And so while they're great at grant writing and fundraising, actual helping in the community isn't being done. So if one did have a program in their community that did help when it was implemented properly, because this is the first year she's ever applied for funding. And it was only because she was running for alderman in her district, and someone told her about the funding. They said, listen, you've been doing the work, your numbers are on point, like your data is amazing. This is yours, just fill it out and get it done. Is there a space where these organizations, if they're listening right now, should apply to or should sign up with, so that an individual maybe in the community who has a need for that program, that they're able to connect with? Is it with the Chamber of Commerce? Is it through the Department of Health? Like, where's the best organization for a parent to find these resources for their young person?
Yeah, see that question is very very broad, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because one, different states have different levels of bureaucracy associated with getting grants, who gets the grants, the rules around getting grants. So the best thing I can say to them is to get in contact with the system supervisors or managers within their community, who works in their community, right? Who's the regional child welfare manager or supervisor, whatever they may call them in your state? Who's the have? Are you guys still getting me?
Yeah, you froze for a little bit.
Okay.
Back.
Yeah. So in our state, the court designated workers program is the front end, right? They get all complaints and they work the diversion piece. Now, although they don't have money to purchase programs, they didn't come to me and offer me a grant. What they came to me is offered me a program, right? They came to me with curriculum, they came to me with training, and they trained my volunteer workforce to provide this diversion program, right? And so not all of the things that you could do and may have opportunity to do with kids will require grants, right? Now, we've gotten organizations to donate things to our program so that we can add opportunities for our kids, give incentive to our kids to create certain outcomes and certain responses from them. And so there are creative ways to find that funding source. But I would tell them to start to get in touch with the leaders within the systems, right? Go to school, talk to the members of your school board, talk to the principals of the local middle school and high school and elementary schools within your community about the programs that you have and how you can be a resource for them, right? When you get connected to the network, right, then what typically happens is folks are thinking about you, especially when they see that you're serious about what you do and you are effective in what you're doing with kids. Then what happens is oftentimes you start to get, I used to love it when I open my email and there's 10, 15 emails telling me about funding sources. At one point, we had nearly $500,000 worth of grants coming into our facility for different programs, right? And so getting connected to folks who work in your community with the kiddos that you want to work with is a good way to start. But you got to get outside of your four walls. You got to get outside your four walls. I started this work by just showing up at meetings. I would read in the paper because here's the thing: if there's a government committee assigned with addressing opioid use among kids, they got to have public meetings and they got to post it, right? And so I started looking at the paper. Some of this stuff didn't make sense. Had a lot of acronyms, but I started showing up at meetings, and before you know it, I got assigned to committees. I got appointed by the governor to serve on committees. And all of a sudden, I started understanding the systems, the processes. I started knowing who the players were within those systems. And then the networking started opening up doors, right? And so you got to get outside your four walls and engage the folks who are working in your community.
All right, this has been a masterclass, honestly, in just community building, right, and youth reform. My last question: looking at the future, right? You named the ages of all your grandchildren. The youngest of them is 6 years old. If we're looking at maybe one or two areas that we should be focusing on to help that 6-year-old grandchild that you have enter into a world where she is able to make missteps without being mishandled by the systems placed around her, what one or two areas would that be?
Let's call a crime and let's call misbehaving. Let's decriminalize normal adolescent behaviors, right? Kids fight, boys fight over girls, girls fight over boys, but now it's assault 3, assault 4, right? Kids are getting charged with, terroristic threatening because they threaten to beat up someone after school. Kids experiment. The adolescent brain development science tells us that kids get to a certain age and they start to experiment with risky behaviors. One of those risky behaviors is drugs, right? And yet we're kicking kids out of school because Trayvon Martin was suspended because they found marijuana residue in his book bag. Not a dime bag, not a half pound of weed, just residue. He was suspended. That's why he was in Sanford, Florida, right? To encounter George Zimmerman, right? That's behavior that could have been dealt with within the context of in-school discipline, right? And so if we want kids to succeed, if we want kids to graduate, if we want to close that achievement gap, then let's minimize exclusionary discipline. Here's a phenomenon. The one thing that affects graduation rates are the number of days a kid spends in school. The more a kid is out of school, the most likely that kid is going to fall behind, and more likely that kid is not going to complete his or her high school education. But if we can keep them in school, guess what happens? They learn. They learn something, right? And so let's decriminalize some of these reactions we have to normal adolescent behavior. Now, I'm not suggesting that a kid that comes into school with a deadly weapon should not be seriously treated and seriously addressed so that kid does no harm to him or his student body. I'm just talking about some of these normal things. I have looked at systems all across the nation, and when we start to pick back the data and we start to look at the kids who are violent criminals, kids who committed crimes against other kids that did bodily harm, we find out that the majority of those kids are not there because they scare us. The majority of those kids are there because they make adults mad. And we need to reserve that extensive and expensive reaction to juvenile delinquency and adolescent misbehaving for the kids who scare us and not the kids who annoy us, right? And if we can keep them in seats, we can get them to that graduation day. And if we can get them to that graduation day, we minimize the likelihood that they're going to be incarcerated as adults.
Wow. Woo! I don't know about you, Nicole. I feel full.
Yes, definitely. I did not know that about Trayvon Martin. I didn't know that he was suspended and that's why he wasn't in school. And it's sad. It takes me back to actually a time where, like, my money was funny, my credit was strange, and everything was just going haywire. And I would get a notice from the bank saying that you had insufficient funds in your account, and so we're going to charge you $35. Well, if I didn't have money to pay that bill, what makes you think I got $35 to pay you?
Right.
Like how can you? It's just one of those things that I would probably never understand. And I pray that my children will never encounter it where they have to be suspended for something silly, where it can't be something that's resolved right away, and it's just really sad that the result of something so minuscule was his life.
Right. And the research tells us that when kids are out of school, bad things happen.
Yep.
When kids are incarcerated, bad things happen. And yet we continue to kick them out of school, right? We take students who are in AP classes, right? We take students who are AB students, and because they got caught with a marijuana cigarette, we disrupt their education, put them in alternative programs, right? Where they don't have AP classes, right? And what happens to that student? That student starts to fall behind, right? Because we want to punish them. We've taken off the education hat, and now we put on the punishment hat, right? But again, I have talked to adults in criminal justice, from lawyers to judges to prosecutors who engaged in similar behaviors when they were 14, 15, 16 years old, right? And they turned out all right, right? And so how do we change our paradigm in dealing with normal adolescent behavior and giving these kids a soft touch and helping them to stay in school and stay on target, as opposed to overreacting and excluding these kids from the learning environment. And oftentimes when kids are not in school, bad things happen. They get involved in things that they shouldn't get involved in, right? And again, this is not a kid that brought a weapon to school and threatened to kill somebody. This is a kid who had a marijuana cigarette in his book bag. This is a kid who pushed a boy because he was trying to hit on his girlfriend, right? And now we got zero tolerance policies around fighting. And so if you get into a fight, you've got to be excluded from the learning environment for a week and a half or 2 weeks, right? And in the end, that's going to hurt that kid, right? And so we've got to come up with different policies. Not to mention, in a lot of cases, those kids get punished multiple times. Like the school punishes them by putting them in alternative school or disciplining them, and oftentimes they get a charge, and then the juvenile justice system punishes them, right? And so we've got to rethink, youth justice in our schools, in our communities, so that we can help these kids through this very chaotic, fun, confusing time called adolescent years.
Well, I think part of what we can initially do to start this journey is to have conversations just like this one. So, cuz I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. As always, it's a pleasure co-hosting with you, Nicole Salter, Jory O'Neill, Pastor Edward L. Palmer Sr. Listen, people, if you don't know, you better forward it to somebody, because these conversations are just going to continue to happen until change is made. That's it for us at 30 Minutes of Power. Speak soon. God bless. Be an empowered person using your power to empower others.
Thank you for tuning in to 30 Minutes of Power. We hope you found today's episode informative and inspiring. To stay connected with us and continue the conversation, follow us on Instagram at 30 Minutes of Power or email us at azironsharpensiron@gmail.com. Don't forget to visit our website at azisi.org to learn more about our mission and how you can get involved. Remember, your power can make a difference in the world. Let's be folks out there using our power to empower others.
30 minutes of power.